We're in lesson 9 of our study of the nature of God, and we're talking, last Wednesday we opened up the discussion about the three characteristics that God has as it relates to mercy, grace, and long-suffering. And we didn't get very far in the study on Wednesday, and so we'll pick up this morning kind of where we left off. If you're looking at those, find that section in lesson 9 that says God's mercy and man's salvation. That's where we're going to start the conversation this morning. I will mention to you that as I did Wednesday night, I feel like, I don't know, it's hard to describe it to you from a teaching standpoint, but sometimes you feel like you've been somewhere for quite a while and you're just kind of ready to think a little differently and move a little differently. So we're going to, after this lesson, there's no more of these lessons out there because we're gonna freeze this study kind of after this one, and we're gonna put it away, and then we're gonna go back. If you recall, we kind of did the same thing with our study of the minor prophets. We went through a handful of the minor prophets, and then we kind of stepped away from that study. And so I want to come back now and look again and finish up that series of the minor prophets. So we'll finish this lesson this morning. We'll discuss it, or we may finish it today. It'll probably be Wednesday, actually, before we get it done. And then we'll pick back up in that study of the minor prophets in the book of Nahum. And if you want, and I want to emphasize this, if you want just a general guide to the remaining minor prophets that we're going to talk about, I'll have those. They're kind of on the rack right now back there in the foyer, but I'll set those out for you to pick up. They are not lessons like this where we're going to use them, and they're simply for your benefit. I know everybody doesn't have a library full of books. Not everybody's got internet access. And so if you want some background information about the minor prophets, if you want some basic concepts of where they were when they wrote, what was going on historically, those kinds of things, I'm offering that to you. It's not a study guide in the sense that we'll come in on Wednesday or whenever we start, and we start at paragraph 1 and work our way through it. It's just for your help and benefit in study. That's all it'll serve as it relates to the study. Otherwise, we'll just move through the books in our study and examine each of those minor prophets in that format. And so, in more traditional format, you might say. And so, anyway, that's where we're heading, just to give you a heads up on that. But we do have probably at least 2 more classes worth of conversation to hold as it relates to these 3 characteristics of the nature of God: His mercy, His grace, and His long-suffering. Now, Wednesday, we defined the differences. What's the basic, definitive difference between mercy and grace? Mercy is... Okay, right. So mercy is punishment withheld. Grace is reward received, right? And so mercy is when you deserved punishment and God didn't give you punishment. Grace is you don't deserve salvation. You don't deserve spiritual blessings that God extends, but His grace offers it to us anyway. Grace is unmerited favor, and so grace is something that we receive that we didn't deserve. Mercy is punishment withheld that we did deserve. And that's the basic difference between mercy and grace as we walk through this study and examine each of these ideas. But without mercy, there is no salvation, because all of us have done what? Romans 3:23. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Add Romans 6:23, I believe. What is the wages of sin is death. So the punishment deserved of sin is death. But because God has mercy, He doesn't force us, in a sense, to have to receive that recompense for sin. He's willing to show us mercy through whom? Through Christ and the sacrifice that Jesus made. But the truth is, all of us then are dependent upon the mercy of God. There is no salvation outside of it. There is no way to receive any benefit from God outside of His mercy, because what is owed or deserved is the punishment that should come because of sin. And there's not necessarily any escaping that. That it's what was supposed to be coming, separate and apart from the mercy of God. And how much mercy does God have to be able to bestow? Unending, right? That's Ephesians 2, right? At the end of that paragraph there on the screen and in your lesson sheets. Ephesians 2, 4, and 5. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. And so, here's a facet of God's nature. His mercy is part of that nature that we need to appreciate as well. What motivates the mercy? According to that text, His love. We've already talked about the nature of God being love and the characteristic of that within the study. But it's the love that God has that allows for Him to extend mercy unto those who deserve punishment and death because of our trespasses against Him. In fact, notice the phrase, even when this mercy, this love was extended, even when we were dead in trespasses. In other words, the trespasses and sin, the wages of sin is death. We were dead in our trespasses, but because of His great love and His mercy, we can find life, in particular, eternal life. Despite those sins and trespasses, we are made alive, at the end of the verse, together with Christ. I think that we need to have a tremendous amount of humility and respect and admiration, a dozen other descriptive words as well, for what God has done for us. We were hopeless, dead in trespasses, unworthy, deserved of the wages of sin. Death should have come. Spiritual death should have been the result for everyone, for the choices that we make. But because His love is pure and holy and righteous and good, and because that love motivates mercy, we're able to see life and have it even eternally because of God's gift. And so because of this great love and the mercy that comes, I don't suppose we could find any greater expression that could come from our Creator. Move forward then in your notes there and go to the next page. I want you to actually jump down where he says, the new covenant of Christ. That paragraph right there at the top of the screen, if you're looking at it on the screen, maybe it'll be up there. So, we can understand that God's love motivates the mercy. We can understand the mercy is extended because we're dead in sin and trespasses, and He can make us alive. We can understand all the definitions. But how do you get there? How is it that I can put myself in a right relationship with God in order that I might have this mercy extended unto me, rather than suffering the consequences of my trespasses? Is there a means by which that God has given us access to this mercy? And obviously the answer to that is the new covenant in Jesus, is the mechanism by which that we're able to come. And notice Hebrews 8 and verse 12 as listed even in your notes. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. God has established a means by which for us to find this mercy. Add Hebrews 4 and verse 16, where he says, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. God recognized that we were going to have to come and access the gifts and the mercy and the grace that He was extending unto us. In other words, we've got a role in this. We've got a part of this process that belongs to us, that we have to be accountable to. And though His mercy's been extended to the trespasser, to the unrighteous, and though Jesus becomes this high priest that enters into the most holy place and allows us access as a priesthood as well, and that's, you can look at the book of Hebrews to see all those kinds of descriptions. But then there's that phrase in Hebrews 4:16, let us therefore then come boldly to the throne of grace. Don't assume it. Don't take advantage in the sense that we just assume that God will just give it to anyone. He's imploring us to come and receive it. And recognize that this is the manner or the means by which that God desires for us to come and receive those benefits. It's part of His nature, but He's given us the responsibility to come and access that mercy and grace, particularly through Jesus. Thoughts or comments? Go ahead, Randy.
Brian, I think that, if you want to look at it as an example, maybe you can look at even our court systems today. I just heard a story the other day about a teenager who was arrested, went to prison, had been involved in drugs, and some, petty theft, if you will. And the story was about him and how he changed his life and went through this, and now he's starting his first term of mayor of the city, but he's become a community figure and all those things. And he says the best thing that he did was have to go to prison because it forced him to do things. But when you talk about come boldly, he was talking about how he worked very hard, not just to overcome certain things, but to get his record expunged, to get all of these things that he wouldn't be here. He couldn't be mayor if he had these things on his record. He couldn't have been the leader that he was in the community without having these things removed. And it's similar to that. We have to go and seek that mercy. We can't just assume that, well, God loves me, so He's going to, I can do whatever I want. And,
I'm going to get this anyway.
I can just say, hey, mercy, and that'll be it. No, there are things that we have to do. And if you look at our court system, parole, probation, all those things are set up. The court says, do this, 200 hours of community service. If you don't do 200, you face the original penalty of whatever it was.
Right.
And that's, it's similar in line to do that.
Mercy may be punishment withheld, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing on behalf of the recipient that they have to do in order to receive it.
It doesn't go away until you, as the person being showed mercy, does what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. And so we have to accept our responsibility in the process. Yep. Any other thoughts? So if the conversation we've been having throughout this study is, if this is the character and nature of God, then who should be adopting that character? We should. We should be adopting the godliness. We should be adopting the character and nature of God. So if God is merciful, we should be merciful. And if God is merciful even when we deserve punishment, then we should also be willing to be merciful even when we deserve something entirely different. Notice the statement out of Micah 6 and verse 8. What is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? It was one thing to talk about what God had done for them, but in return, what is God asking of them? Malachi says, what does God desire from you because you received mercy? Well, He wants you to love and extend that same kind of mercy unto others. In fact, when you add the statements and thoughts that Jesus extends in Luke 6 and verses 35 and 36, where He said, love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. It's kind of interesting because sometimes we almost make the statement maybe that it's not human nature to want to be merciful when people do unkind things to you. But I'm always careful about what I say when it comes to human nature. Because where did human nature come from? From God. So human nature's origin is the image of God that was stamped on us. So when we start talking about negative human nature, probably a better description would be negative human behavior. What human beings choose rather than what they were designed and created to be. Because if we're created in the image of God, He is merciful. The natural should then be a heart of mercy and grace extended unto others. But the truth of the matter is that's something we actually have to, in some senses, be taught. It's a behavior in some senses that we kind of have to encourage in our own lives to show forth. Because the truth is, when people do us wrong, the instinct that has been created by human behavior is to retaliate or to be spiteful or to be vindictive anytime somebody crosses our path. I'm not saying people aren't accountable for their actions. The Bible speaks about accountability. We just talked a few moments ago about how we have to even accept our role in the process of receiving mercy. But the question isn't really in this moment about whether other people do what they're supposed to do. The question when it comes to me adopting the image and character of God is, am I willing to be that way? Am I willing to be merciful and kind? Am I willing to withhold punishment and vindictiveness and vengefulness when that's what others would tell me I should be doing? Am I willing to extend mercy even over judgment? Notice James 2 verse 13. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. I want you to think about that statement. Whoop, thought I had a pen ready. Hang on one second. And I want you to think, oh, come on. Maybe I'll just do it. Well, no, I can't do it that way either. My apologies. I thought that would work. But it's not wanting to let me pick it. Never mind. You can see it, right? Mercy triumphs over judgment. And so, which do we normally want? Don't you think about that for a minute? Which one do we normally want? Oh, exactly. What we want when it's us is mercy. What do we want for the other guy? Judgment. We want judgment for the other guy. We want mercy when it's me. Now, I understand. We could look at Scripture and we could talk about how God has authorized government and how government has a responsibility to create laws and govern its people and even measure out discipline when necessary, protect its citizens. All of that is true. But he's not talking in this thought about what the legalities of a local place or a nation should be. He's talking about what is your disposition? What do you desire? And let me just ask you to just think in your own mind for a minute, and it's a fair question for me to consider as well. When we see wrongdoing, what usually is the first reaction? I want justice, judgment, right? From a personal level, what he's saying is mercy should triumph over judgment. There's a proper place for judgment, right? There's a proper place for government to fulfill its role. There's a proper place, obviously, for God to fulfill His role because He's righteous, perfectly righteous in His judgments. I'll dare you maybe right now, but who's sitting here is ready to raise your hand and saying your judgments have always been right? Anyone? No takers, right? Oh, I did raise my hand. Sorry. It's illustrated only. And so we should probably err on the side of mercy. Mercy triumphs judgment. And if I'm going to err one way or the other, but the truth is, among a lot of Christians, they seem to prefer the judgment side of the equation. There's a proper place for it, but not in our personal mindset. Our personal mindset should want to extend mercy, to even give folks beyond the benefit of the doubt, to do our best to want to think the best of others and the circumstances that we're seeing. We shouldn't be quick to judgment. We should be quick to be merciful. Now, judgment, again, I want to make sure you hear me clearly. Judgment will have its proper place. Ultimately, God said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So eventually, whereas we might struggle sorting it out, God will ultimately be able to sort it out. But if I have to choose from a personal perspective which way I would lean, mercy is an important aspect for us to consider, maybe first, rather than a rush to judgment about the circumstances and situations that we see and hear about. Because we can evidence anecdotally this morning. I mean, I could just start listing you moment after moment after moment where people rushed to judgment, and they were what? They were completely wrong. They were completely wrong on the issue. They didn't have all the facts. They didn't know all the circumstance. They didn't really have an understanding of what was really happening in that moment. But they chose to rush to judgment. All I'm trying, and I'll stop now, I think I've made this point strong enough, that we should rush to mercy. Should be the disposition and character that we have. That doesn't mean there's not going to be some things that have to be dealt with and some judgment that will have to take place. Judge righteous judgment is just as much Bible as well. But from a nature and character standpoint, mercy needs to be part of that. I think I saw you.
I think social media this week alone has shown us that point right there. And instead of taking time to think about it before you react, will help you and find out all the information first. But you're right. If there's something wrong, you can call it wrong.
Yeah. It can be noted as that's sin. That's not right in the eyes of God. And make righteous judgments about those things according to the standard of God. From a vengeful, vindictive, judgmental standpoint, mercy is the superior. If you couldn't hear what Doris said said social media is a key contributor to that problem. Now, I pointed out that she said that because, I put a moratorium on my allowance of talking about social media the other day. But she mentioned it just a moment ago about how it's one of the contributing problems of rushing to judgment. And so we've got to find a right balance of recognizing sin, acknowledging sin, stating it for what it is and the consequences it can bring as it relates to it, but find also the ability to be merciful when it comes to circumstances.
So, what would you say would be the difference between judgment and prudence?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Like you said, it's a balance.
Yeah.
That's a kind of tricky thing for me to understand.
Yeah. And maybe in some senses they're two different conversations. there's a need for reproof, correction, instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be thoroughly furnished unto all good works. And so obviously there's a need at time for us to come. And I think maybe the balance, Brian, is maybe there's a difference between taking something that God has already judged. Here's an issue, a sin, a practice, a choice, and God has already stamped His judgment on it. He's already said, this is, maybe there's a difference between taking what God has already deemed and exposing that to others, and me out of my own conscience and mindset trying to judge over other people. Finding a balance between, is this me being judgmental, or am I applying the standard of God to this circumstance? Maybe that's where the balance needs to be found. But I agree with you. There are moments where we have to take the judgments of God and use them to help reprove and correct and instruct others. I'll go back to you, Bob.
So, scripturally, like a presidential pardon, how do we look at that as a Christian? Mercy, or are you letting the guilty go free?
Yeah.
We know how God deals with how the innocent being, punished and guilty going free.
Yeah.
Some of the scriptures, like you're letting the person go who's been convicted by the law.
Yeah.
And I just, I wonder. Sometimes I wonder about that.
And I do, and I struggle with it in some senses as well, because on one side you're right. You think, well, no, the oppressor ought to receive the recompense of his, in the consequences of his decision, and governmentally, when they're pardoned, it seems not right that they didn't bear out the fullness of those consequences. But on the other hand, I also recognize that we're technically on judgment, we're all going to stand before God and be guilty. We're all going to stand before Him and be guilty, and we're going to need His mercy to carry us through that moment. And so you're right, it isn't as simple as just saying choose mercy all the time or choose judgment all the time. Some recognition of what God's principles that are motivating those choices and decisions may have to be applied in various circumstances. And every pardon may not be equal too. Some pardons may have some legitimacy because of the backstory that we don't know when it comes to some of those things. Go ahead, Bob.
There's a lot of scenarios where mercy could be in life, and you don't always use mercy when like with your children, when you're trying to instruct. Mercy is not something that would be entered into so much as what it would be correction. But as far as me as an individual, God tells me how I should judge. Yeah. Lest you be judged.
Yeah.
So, you got to take everything that He says to you and apply it to your own life on how you're going to handle certain situations.
Yeah. And what Bob's talking about over there is that you kind of got to take the whole of everything God has said and make wise decisions and choices about how, is this a moment where consequence needs to be accepted and accountable to the person, or is this a moment where mercy is, I don't want to say warranted, but mercy is the right path to take in that circumstance and apply everything that there is. And that's why I tried to use the word when I initiated this conversation, that we err on the side of mercy. Not that there aren't times where it's pretty clear that judgment's what's warranted in a particular moment. There are going to be moments where God's word is clear, reproof is what's necessary, instruction in righteousness needs to come because of choices and behaviors that people were involved in. And so there are going to be some very clear moments where that's the way we should go. But if I'm waffling and I'm trying to determine what's the right approach here, and should I accept somebody's apology? Should I want them to be accountable, but should I embrace their apology and extend mercy when I'd rather punish them? Those are the moments that we're talking about, maybe more so. How do I react in that? Which way do I lean in those moments?
I think, too, reproof, judgment, and what we're talking about, little bit, and I don't want to get into church discipline in that sense, but look at the format that was set up. Go to the person. That would be, to me, that's kind of, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about instruction. We're going to talk about the decisions that you're making, why this, two people, so on. Then you reach a point where, okay, we've done a lot of this. We've tried, we've made efforts. Judgment is now there. Judgment to me is more final in a sense than something else. And I think that's in a sense with your children when you talk about that. There's levels of discipline as you go through. So the first time they do something, it's okay. Second time they do that, it's a little more. Third time, and after that, we're making those decisions. So to me, judgment's a little more final in that respect. But judgment for us as Christians, or at least in a sense of life, is also about bringing the person, be it a believer or a non-believer, bringing the person back to Christ or to Christ. We want to set the example of being different. The purpose of that is to bring that person or those people to Christ. Yeah. And it's that example. And it's, we're making a judgment about this particular thing being wrong. I'm not going to allow that in my life.
Yeah. And to use the clarity of that judgment that comes from God as to what He desires for people to turn from sin and come. And maybe, and that helps maybe frame some of this conversation, is the mercy needs to be understood a little bit in the sense of how do I handle that moment when that person starts, when the prodigal comes home, when the man in 1 Corinthians was told to be, God, Paul says, send him over to Satan because that's where he's at. But then the second letter comes and the man has repented and shown signs of godly sorrow, and Paul says, thank you for embracing him and showing mercy in that circumstance.
With God, we have responsibility in receiving that mercy, and that's a good example. When he repents in 2 Corinthians, they're told how to handle it differently, yep. And that's where the mercy comes in. You still should be judged this way. Yeah. Your punishment should be this, but it's not. Now we're going to show mercy and let that go.
And so penitence is probably is part of the mercy conversation as it relates to that.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of it also has to do with your heart. You have to be willing to give that mercy to somebody. You have to be, just because you're asking for forgiveness or somebody asks for forgiveness of something, you should give that to them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to not have to deal with any consequences of their actions. And when you were talking about this, one thing that kind of stuck in my mind was the shooting in the church down in South Carolina. All those followers went and said they forgave him, but he still had to face the consequences of his actions.
And personal mercy that's extended doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be able to escape. They may not receive any consequence from me, but their actions still may find themselves. And that's where I say that's where we have to kind of give place to the right institution at times to fulfill its particular role as it comes to this. I'll come back to you. Go ahead. No, I'll come back to Brian. Go ahead. I saw you.
Mercy doesn't necessarily mean approval. You can give mercy, but still say, I don't approve of what you did.
Yeah. But
God doesn't approve of what you did.
Right. But I'm willing to be merciful and kind and forgiving. Doesn't change the fact that doesn't mean what you did was right. Go ahead, Brian.
I think I found an answer. Like watching it, it kind of sums up the whole.
Good.
There's a big passage here. It's in Psalm 50, verse 16 through 23. But unto the wicked God saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? Seeing thou hatest instruction, and castest my words behind thee, when thou sawest a thief, and then thou consentest with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Thou givest thy mouth to evil, and with deceit. Thou sittest and speakest against thy brother, thou slanderest thine own mother's son. These things hast thou done, and I have kept silent. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself, but I will reprove thee, and set them in order before thine eyes. Now consider this, ye that forget God, lest I tear you in pieces, and there be none to deliver. Whoso offereth praise glorifieth me, and to him that ordereth his conversation aright will I show salvation. To me, that's the character, that's the...
Yeah, mercy can be found by glorifying and having our conversation right. Consequences found in the opposite. Any other thoughts? I realize I'd open that can of worms, but it's okay. All right, let's quickly, we've got just a handful of minutes here left, but let's go back. I want you to look at that next statement where he says, we are, how did I get to? There it is. We are to be merciful like our God. I guess I already scrolled and didn't remember. Nope, that's not right. My apologies. I wanted to look at that thought. Turn over. Yeah, go to Matthew chapter 18 for a minute. I did want to look at this parable of the unmerciful servant. We won't have time this morning to do it justice, but let me at least take a quick look. Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. So this is that scene where Peter comes and asks Jesus how many times he should what? Yeah, how many times? How often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times. 7 was that complete number, and used literally sometimes and figuratively. Figuratively, that ought to be enough, and literally is that enough? Jesus said unto him, I say unto thee until 7 times, but say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Jesus illustrates not a number, in other words. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But for as much as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. And the servant fell down and worshipped him, and saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. And we're going to run out of time. Tell me the rest of this. What happened after that?
He went out and went to people that owed him.
Yeah. So he grabs so he just was forgiven a tremendous debt, and then somebody owes him a small debt, and he's ready to throw him in prison, right? And when the master that had forgiven and shown mercy to him found out about that, the tables turned. What I simply want us to appreciate quickly is that God's mercy does have limitation. God was willing to be merciful to the one. That's the imagery. But the minute he saw that somebody who he had shown mercy to was unmerciful, the tables turned. One of the characteristics of God is that He's willing to withhold judgment, and He's willing to be forgiving, and He's willing to be merciful, and He's willing to be all of the above. But when He doesn't see that in return from us, if He doesn't see us adopting His character, then He's back to the other side of that coin within the conversation. Okay, Lord willing, Wednesday night we'll talk about grace and long-suffering.